Well, good afternoon. It's Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Higher Ed Live. Higher Ed Live is part of the Higher Ed Live Network, a series of professional development web shows and podcasts, which are always free and accessible to you in the archives at higheredlive.com and on iTunes. You can be a part of our broadcast today by tuning in live and sharing your insights and questions using the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter. You can also receive weekly updates with live show dates and the times by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. Today's show would not be possible without the support of Cornell University, M-Stoner, and Omni Update. Higher Ed Live is produced by M-Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. In July, M-Stoner is hosting an in-depth two-part webinar series focused on how colleges and universities can offer program, major, and degree pages that don't suck. These are the products our institutions offer, yet many degree pages on EDU sites are long, lackluster, and lifeless. We're tweeting out a link now where you can learn more and find out how to register. Omni Update is the leading web content management system, CMS, provider for higher education. The company's web CMS is called OU Campus. It's secure, scalable, and has great tools and features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community. Part 2 of Omni Update's Small Web Team series is up on their blog, and we're just sending out a link for that as well. I'm your host, Ashley Budd, and on today's show, I'm speaking with two of higher education's finest about information. And it might seem like a dry or broad topic, but it turns out information maintenance and delivery is often viewed as so simple that it gets missed altogether. So I'm going to call on two prominent pieces of web jargon to guide our conversation today. IA, for information architecture, and UX, the user experience. Information architecture, as you might gather, is the way that we arrange our information structurally online. And user experience refers to the way in which our visitors interact with our sites, often in search for specific information. So for those of you participating in today's show via social media, please reach out if you're currently working on an information architecture or user experience project. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and you can send those our way anytime on Twitter using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. I'm pumped to have two of my favorite people on today's show. Fran Zablocki is joining us from Rochester, New York. Right, Fran? Are you in Rochester today?
All right. I am.
Fran's in Rochester, and he is strategist at M-Stoner. He's been speaking about this very topic on some of those in-depth webinar series that M-Stoner has been producing. So we're going to tap him for his expertise. And then we've also got Nick DeNardis coming to us from Detroit. Yeah. And Nick is the director of digital communications at Wayne State, and we're gonna grill him on some of this user experience stuff, and also just try to get a sense of where this all fits into your web planning and how you might be able to explain this information gathering concept to your senior leadership. So we can jump right in and we can start talking about information architecture. And I'm going to ask Fran how I explain information architecture to my mom.
That's a great question, because information architecture is really ambiguous, and it's one of those things that it's very abstract. So you almost need an analogy of some sort in order to make it concrete enough to even to people who work on the web, much less your mom. Not to say that your moms might not work on the web, but we're gonna assume for a second that mom's not too savvy about this. So I think the best analogy is probably a library analogy. I mean, I've used it before, where IA actually evolved from a lot of the professionals who were the first information architects, actually self-purported information architects, started out in library sciences, and there's still a really, really strong undercurrent of library scientists in the IA field. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of things that translate between the two areas. And so, it's all about organizing and classifying information, right? When you go to a library, for those of you who are might be old enough to remember. I mean, you had like the Dewey Decimal System was used to, categorize different types of literature and different types of reference, and that's essentially what we're doing online. I mean, we're just taking all the information that we have, and we're trying to figure out a way to organize it in a way that makes sense to people and is labeled in a way that people understand. So in a sense, as information architects, we're like the reference librarian who is trying to anticipate the people who are coming into our information library and asking us, what should I be, what should I look for? What do you have here for me? What's the most important thing I should look at? So there's a lot of things that translate from the idea of being a librarian for digital content. So that's what I would say. I would say, Mom, I'm like a digital librarian, and I work in a library on the internet. That's what I would say.
I really like that.
The internet?
Maybe that's what I would say to my mom. But anyway.
I like that, and I like the visual that you can create and thinking about card catalogs, and when you had to go to the library and use the card catalog, everyone knew the system that you were using. Everything had to be very well organized, and if you think about those rows of cards that you would have to kind of sort through, it's very much like how we could think about a navigation system, and menus that we pull down are kind of like those card racks that we had to pull out. But I don't think we're going to be able to use that analogy with the younger generations. I'm not even sure that they would have seen card catalogs. So
there's usually like one in every library now that they just kind of put on display off to the side. So I'm sure they've seen it.
The relics.
The museum.
Yes.
Ancient
they're in glass. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I like that analogy, and if you could kind of help us break down then how we're organizing information on the web, because I think that's the first big piece of this is we know as institutions we have to provide a lot of really basic information. We have a lot of information that evolves or changes every year as we do updates to things, and then of course we have the more dynamic and social content that lives on our web that might be classified in a whole different kind of way. But if we even just think about the most basic information that we all have to provide, how does that get organized in a web space? And I'm going to throw that back to you, Fran.
Okay. The answer is a lot of different ways, right? And this gets into the area of user browsing behavior and the idea that when you go to a website, even if it's the same website you've been to before, you have a particular piece of information in mind that you're looking for, or you don't know if the particular piece of information is there. So that's one break right there. There's different ways. So if I don't know something's there, I'm going to use a different browsing path and different method than if I know it's there. If I am trying to figure out what to look for based on a topic, I'm going to look at a topical navigation. If I'm saying to the website, hey, I'm Fran and I'm an alumnus of your college, I want to know what you have for that particular audience, well then you're using an audience navigation for that. If I basically am like, you know what, I need to sign up for a class and apply, then I'm going to be using a transactional navigation, or I'm going to be looking for something that says apply now, or to do basically a call to action to do something. So it's tricky because there's so many different use cases and there's so many different ways that people use the web and use information online that you really, the best practice is to try to anticipate as many of those pathways as possible and design really sound systems for each potential browsing path. And so, I think that the most common one that we all are familiar with is the hierarchical topical navigation that you see across many higher ed websites, which reads something similar to admissions, athletics, academics, student life, things like that. Like those are the big buckets of information that we put all of our information into topically. But people are coming at this from every possible angle and from every possible need. And so the more we can offer a variety of different types of navigation pathways, I think the better the overall user experience is going to be. And so I think that's how the two connect to each other.
So what would you? So I guess like I've never actually had found a label for this, but what would you call something that was a navigation system that didn't look at it from that kind of homepage out perspective, but literally just looked at an inventory of pages, and then each page acted as like its own node. And we're like, okay, what's the content on this page? What would someone need to get to purely from this page? And for more information or for a broader perspective, you know, about the institution or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, what would you call something like that?
I mean, that's a good question. I think the idea that every page is a home page and that you need to be able to provide navigation to get everywhere else from there, even if you're deep linking. So there's a big debate about whether or not breadcrumb navigation is worthwhile. And I think breadcrumb navigation is worthwhile. I'm in that camp because I think people usually, when they are looking for information online, are going to type something into Google, and they're going to end up at a very specific resource, and it might be a resource on your page, but it's probably buried within the actual topical navigation by several layers. And so if you don't know at what layer you've entered your website, and you don't know like what preceded that, like what the bigger bucket is that you're living in, and then what the bucket that's even bigger than that is, then it's going to be tough for you to figure out where you're going. So having universal navigational elements like a global topical navigation, a global footer navigation on every single page guarantees that no matter where anybody starts, they can always end up at at the same place. But I also think there's an area in IA that used to be called bottom-up IA, but now you'd probably label it content templates, where you are trying to figure out what the structure of a particular type of subpage is. And so a good example is an academic program page. So you want a particular type of informational structure for each one of your academic program pages, and you want those to be consistent from academic program page to academic program page. So there's a lot of terminology thrown around. I think it's one of the difficulties actually is like, how do we label? It's ironic, that in a field where we're professionally labeling things, that IA and UX and all of the other various areas of expertise have such a different and varying way of labeling themselves. I don't necessarily know that there's been agreement on all that, but yeah, I would say that top-down IA, hierarchical IA is the way we typically think of it, organized on that main menu and on your home page. But bottom-up IA and content templates are really where it's at as far as providing value to deeper pages of your site. So,
Fran, there's a lot in there that I want to synthesize, and then I want to let Nick comment. One of the big things that you mentioned there was every page being a home page, and I think that was kind of what Nick was leading with his question. He was kind of trying to get you there, but that's a newer topic for a lot of people, and it's something that is, I think, a powerful statement to make to senior leadership when you're talking to them about this kind of a project, that the way people are getting to our websites is not always landing on the homepage and then figuring out where they're going to go next.
Yeah, and you can easily
people that
show
are
that.
searching for information, they're usually looking for something very specific, and quite frankly, our search tools on our websites they're usually horrible. So they're going to Google and they're searching there and landing on our page. And what Fran was saying is that you have to treat all of those pages as important as your homepage is built, because you want them to be able to navigate from there. So I just wanted to make sure that that big thought was captured. And Nick, yeah, I'd love to hear where you were actually going with that labeling question.
Well, yeah. So where I was initially going was asking to see if there was a term to use that thought of how do we create our architecture for our site, not based on that top-down bulleted list, kind of traditional way, but here are all of the pages that are going to be on our site. How do we kind of connect the dots between each page and each other page? So not necessarily thinking about someone coming into the home page or something like that, but thinking about, all right, so think about every page as somebody coming into that. Now what other pages are in relation to them, even if there's the same page referenced on every single one of those pages. but just kind of almost think of it like as like node-based navigation, right? Where every page is kind of a node tradition, you know, like thinking of the traditional HTML, you know, hyperlink perspective, right? That every page is its own complete element that can link to another one, but that information is what brings those, you know, relationships together, not just the technical bringing those things together. But that does go back to what you were saying, Ashley, about the every page is a home page, and Fran, I know, was talking about that too. But you brought it up in a sense that leadership focuses so much on the home page, and when you can shift their mind to thinking about each individual page, it brings a whole different shift to the way that navigation is approached. And you can, you know, I think you can easily do that, and I've done it myself in the past, where you can show the statistics that on a, you know, for your site, the landing pages from your analytics, whether that be Google Analytics or whatever, you'll see that yes, the homepage gets a lot of traffic, but from a landing page perspective, you know, it's only like probably 20 to 30% of the entrance traffic, whereas like 70% of the entrance traffic is one of those interior pages, and that potentially could be a first impression of your institution on one of those interior pages, and then how to then get those tasks done, like register or search for classes, and, you know, find about alumni events and stuff like that. And so, you know, framing the discussion around how to navigate to different items bridges, I almost think, the gap between information architecture and user experience, because that they're almost inseparable, because you, at some point, no matter how nice of a navigation and architecture that you make, a user is going to have to experience that. They're going to have to get in there and find information or not find information, and get some results. And so I don't know exactly where I was going with that.
Well, I have a question. We'll keep going. So, you know, we think about information architecture and user experience as going hand in hand, and one is part of the other is part of another. So, you know, Fran was talking a lot about navigation, and how we're trying to guide our user, as, you know, this is an essential piece of how they overlap. So I want to ask how we start thinking about our user when we're doing this kind of planning, and what is it about our, you know, our user of 2014 that we should especially be thinking about?
Can I jump in real quick? I think the first thing you think about is search. So if you're not mining the search terms that people are typing in on your homepage or whatever other page you're on, if you don't have at least the search terms, even if it's not even related to what page they were on when they searched for that, that is number one step, because at the end of the day, they're either, number one, using that because they are just, that's how they navigate web pages now, not just your site, the web, right? And then I would also then look at, so that's how they navigate, and that's also how they think of, if they can't find something on your page that they've landed on, that one page that they're using that search box on, then there potentially is something wrong with that page. You can, by diving into it, you can see really if there is a correlation there or not. But that, I think, is the first part to start.
And Nick, I'm going to stop you with that, because I think it's important to even dive deeper on search and SEO. And I think that's another thing that what I found with senior leadership is that it doesn't really click that search is important for our institutions. I think we just expect that we are going to show up in search because we are XYZ institution, and we don't really have to do anything to make ourselves show up in search. And what I've found, and I hope, Fran, I hope you'll laugh about this, but when we, when we look at our keywords and we're matching them against who else is showing up in those keywords, a lot of times we find ourselves competing with ourselves. And you find a lot of times, like a business school at your own institution will be dominating the front Google page. Okay, so good. I got some laughs. This does resonate. You know, your business school is dominating your first page Google results because they're the only ones paying attention to SEO. And now all of a sudden, your homepage, your central marketing communications efforts are competing with your own schools. Does that resonate? Is that something, you know, is SEO just this thing that we expect to happen and is not being paid attention to, or is that just me?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of instances where there aren't any thoughtful plans put together for search engine optimization, and I think all this stuff's interrelated, right? So like the better a job you're doing to plan out what keywords you're using on pages, the better your search results are going to be. So if your page titles match the links that point to them, then that's consistent, and that's going to be useful to people who are searching for those pages online. Labeling and taxonomy and controlled vocabularies are all areas of information architecture which translate really, really directly to search engine optimization, because you're trying to figure out what terms people are using to describe things, basically. And so if you can match the terms most accurately, your results are going to be better. And in a lot of cases, yeah, that's what's happening, is like either you've misidentified what your audience is using to describe something, or you just haven't put much thought into it, and it's kind of defaulting, and other entities are getting ranked higher than you because of it, basically.
Awesome. Well, we're getting some Twitter love on that as well. So it's not just me. It's not just us. So Nick, I want you to be able to continue, since you made such a good point. I had to go down that rabbit hole. But tell me a little bit more about our user and how we should be planning for them.
So that's an interesting question. How should we plan for our users? Who are our users? And this isn't a question that can be answered as, this is what you should look at from a user's perspective, because every department, every school, college, depending if you're a more student-facing, current student-facing, prospective student-facing, alumni-facing, however, your users are a different stage in their life. They have different priorities. They interact with technology differently. Everybody is, every area within at least a university campus for sure, has a specific type of user. And I think identifying who your ideal user is important, number one. And that ideal user might not be like everyone thinks of them as, oh, it's everybody. We want everybody to use our site. It really isn't, right? It is, this type of student who's just getting, out of their senior year in high school, and we want to do this. Like, there should be at least one or two, at the most three types of users that you can at least pinpoint, which then kind of drives that, well, how do they, what are they interacting with on the web? What do they actually need from the web? And it might be that, they don't want to talk to anybody, so they would rather use live chat, on your web page, because that feels instant, because it is, compared to email, and they maybe don't want to pick up a phone and stuff. So those types of considerations, I think, breed right into what the user experience is for your site. Not just, is your site designed really well, it does get something navigable, and does it show up in search, but literally, how can you make your site, the content on your site, resonate with that that individual that you're trying to target? And so often in higher ed, at least, we send out a lot of physical mail, which can only do so much of that because it's getting very expensive, or email, right? And that can only hold so much information, and all that extended information is online. And so I think that a lot of the user experience work that I've been interacting with, my institution has started offline and started at how are these people prompted to get to the site, and then how do we continue that on in the actual site, not only from like a labeling perspective and a navigation perspective, but from a visual perspective and what device they're on. An example would be if there are still lots of higher ed sites out there that aren't responsive. But if you're sending out an email to tell them to go do something on a specific site, if you're not mining your information about what devices, prospective or current student is looking at their email on, it's probably going to be a mobile device, I'm betting. And if that site doesn't work well on that mobile device, no matter how good the desktop experience is, the actual experience translated to that activity isn't going to be so great.
Yeah, I think the fact that we have so many different screen sizes and devices, like Nick, you're saying, like, it makes it that much harder to figure out what, how to put together all these elements. Navigation is no exception. I mean, we talk about responsive design. Well, there's also responsive navigation. I mean, you cannot fit as much information on a small screen. So one reaction to that, initially was to say, well, we need to cut out links. And then there was a backlash to say, well, no, you want people to be able to find the same information no matter how they get to it, but you can't fit it there. So then people came up with creative solutions like off-screen navigation for mobile. So like you swipe to the left or the right, and there's the navigation, but it's been hidden from view until you do that. And so I think it's a pretty exciting place right now, actually, figuring out how to display enormous amounts of information on very, very small screen sizes, and there's some really, really interesting, innovative stuff going on. That within higher ed, but also outside of higher ed. So I think no matter what your lens into UX is, whether it's IA or design or strategy or interaction design, you got to be thinking about multiple devices and how they're going to play. And I mean, I think consistency is key across. No matter what you're doing, I think people expect consistency, and honestly, user behavior is across multiple devices. And think about how many times you start searching for something and looking at it like while you're on your way someplace and you're on a mobile phone, and then you sit down at your laptop and you want to continue that experience, and you don't want it to be so jarringly different that you're going to like lose track of where you were. And if we're calling things different things, or if if there's only 4 links on the mobile menu and there's 10 links on the desktop menu, that's going to throw you off as a user, and it's going to make it more difficult for you to find what you need. And so those are some of the pitfalls that we have to try to avoid when we're talking about multi-device UX, essentially.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that you brought up earlier about breadcrumbs and using that as like a structure. And I remember when back in the day, breadcrumbs used to be like the thing, right? It was like the technical way to like navigate a site, and tech people loved it. And there was this backlash, like, well, real users don't use it. And that might have been true at that time, but now I feel like we've been experimenting with them more and finding that breadcrumbs are very useful, especially in a mobile device, a smaller device that when somebody either starts on the desktop and then they end up getting to a smaller device when they're trying to investigate something, that the full navigation on that context about where they're at in the site is easily visible on the desktop. But as soon as they get to mobile and they land on a page, it obviously isn't going to look like that desktop page, right? So we've been trying to use breadcrumbs just kind of at the top of the page, only on mobile, to see is that enough information to orient the user about where they're at, because we've hidden the navigation, we've hidden a lot of the actual context, visual context of where they're at. Can we use the breadcrumbs just in this sense to allow them to see where they're at, so that they're confident that they can move on what they were doing on the desktop initially, or or started on a mobile device. And so I think that there are things that we don't need to remove from a mobile view, but I think that the context is so different that there are different opportunities for that information.
Yeah.
Great points, guys. I'm going to keep you moving along. We've got great activity on the back channel, and I think one of the things that I'm still trying to wrangle, and our viewers might be, is that we just have a ridiculous amount of content and information, and there really, there's not a best practice list sitting out there that we can all just follow, nor should we. But how do we start wrangling all of this? Maybe, Fran, I wanted to ask how we begin to scope a project, but maybe we shouldn't get into that just yet. And Nick, I also want to throw to you a question about how we start mapping this information to calls to action. I really liked your approach of starting with the offline. Where is our user coming from? They don't live in the phone. They don't live in the computer. So
some do, and
Speak for yourself.
yeah.
Thinking about them as a person first, I think, is a very human and sane way to think about this. So I really like that. I'm going to use that, especially when I'm talking. I think it's just so powerful when you're talking to senior leadership to kind of bring it back to reality, because we might live in the web world a little bit more than they do. So talking about where the person is when they receive our message that prompts them to enter our web space, and where does that bring them, that is the first piece for a direct call to action. And we're also thinking about people that are just happening upon our pages too. So Fran, I want to start with you and just try to help us wrangle this ridiculous amount of content that we're trying to organize, and if we feel like things are spinning out of control, how we might begin to scope a project like this.
Okay. Well, the honest answer is it's going to be a lot of work, no matter what, no matter how you cut it, right? There's certain areas that lend themselves to shortcuts. Content auditing and IA aren't one of them. Sorry. There's so much information out there, and even just the process of figuring out what you have can take a long time. And there's been lots of discussions about is a content audit worth it? How deep should we go with the content audit? Because if I just try to figure out what I have, I'll spend the rest of my time doing that and not actually create anything new. So it's like, how deep do you go? So knowing what your own capacity for getting that nitty-gritty detail is, and knowing honestly like what value there is at the deepest, darkest levels of your site, and knowing where to kind of cut it off is important. I mean, as far as just some rules of thumb is for the amount of time that we budget for IA work. I mean, it takes just reviewing a current site and mapping out the way it looks takes several hours, right, for an average size department site. How many dozens or hundreds of department sites does each institution have? A lot. And if you assume that it takes another half a day to put together the IA structure, the new IA structure, and that's a pretty efficient way of doing it, like an entire day. One person, one day for one department is very aggressive. And that's once you get into it and kind of understand the overarching layout. The good news is, and that so consistency is useful for the people who are running the website just as much as it is for the people who are using the website, because if you have templates, if you have IA templates, let's say all your academic departments have the same starter set of organizational scheme, and then you can kind of modify from there, that's going to save you a lot of time. So you basically you get the approved, here's the basic academic department template, get that approved, copy, paste, and at least you've got a starting point. You're like halfway there with the rest of them. Where you get tripped up is that you've got a lot of different service sites, you've got a lot of different oddball stuff, like you might have different centers on campus, you might have different offices that really don't, that are just unique entities, and they need their own custom organizational scheme, and so they're going to take a little bit longer. So it really takes a very long time. I mean, to give you an example, we worked with an institution to redo the information architecture for two divisions, the Student Affairs Division and the College of Arts and Sciences, and we did over 90 different departmental sites and did the information architecture completely wholesale overhaul, all the way down to the deepest level, every page, every link. And that process from start to finish took about 9 months for a team on our end of 5 and a team on their end of about 5 as well. So just to give you an idea of doing how much work it's going to be. Sorry to rain on the parade, but I mean, yeah, I know, but it's a lot of work, and that's why it needs to be taken seriously. I mean, you need to devote resources to this in order to do it well. You can't just put a sheen on top of it. I mean, you could take like the top 2 levels of pages, which is usually what happens, right? We're so slammed for resources that we just don't have the time to get that deep, and we just kind of go over the homepage and like the second level page and maybe some of the third level pages. You redo that, but there's still like thousands and thousands of pages in the depths that just kind of like hang out there and accumulate over time, and it can get to be a pretty scary place.
Yeah, but it's what's unfortunate about that is that if you don't, there's there isn't anything from an institutional perspective. I'm thinking from somebody who works at an institution, right? So there isn't it's a scary place for you as someone who cares about the web, the experience, and like sees the web as like a craft. And when you see those things, you like they irk you, right? Like they're the things that like start bothering you. Whereas anyone else, I would say the typical campus worker, they're out of sight, out of mind. And so what could potentially be a trigger that kind of, if we only say have the opportunity to do the top 2 levels of pages, because we do have a time or actual budget or personnel restriction, how do we then evolve that later on and make sure that it's still an ongoing discussion, and it is a way to that these kind of, I don't know, I'm thinking of the term like from a technical debt perspective, like how do we start paying off that kind of debt that we've created by not handling these pages and giving people a great experience only at a certain level? Like how do we have this pay off this 2-tier debt problem?
Yeah, Nick, that's a great question to pose, because these more abstract things that people who are close to the work know are so important often don't get translated into the bigger picture. What I think will bridge that gap is setting some key performance indicators for those sites that are linked to calls to action that are important to senior leadership or whoever is in charge of that evolution or maintenance at a higher level. And if you can demonstrate a better performance, and I would say that has to be through click-through rate and time in the site, and in whatever it is you're trying to get your people to do, and you can demonstrate that they're not bouncing, they're not confused with this new structure, that you might be able to justify the investment rolling out farther.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to pose it? And do you think we do enough of that long-term kind of goal setting around this and maybe some other kinds of important pieces of our websites that that get lost among those bigger decision makers?
Yeah, I think that prototyping, which is I think what you're describing, is a really necessary and useful way of doing this. I mean, I think if you have a particular department that has resources and has some savvy, and you can do one site 100% really, really well, and then use that as your, the dog and pony show as you go to like talk to senior administration, and you can show some analytics numbers. I think you can do that without having to do the entire project to prove that it's worthwhile. So I think that can really help as far as doing things in a limited budget. Having an all-star to like trot out when you need to make the case for more resources is definitely the way to go. And of course, jealousy plays a part too, right? Like if somebody has a site that looks fantastic and is really, really intuitive, and somebody else doesn't, they're going to be like, hey, wait a minute, like I want that. And it's like, well, if you want that, you could help us out. So that's
totally.
A couple different tactics.
No, I didn't want to distract from your content inventory architecture kind of raining on our parade about how much time that actually takes, because it really does take a lot of time, but it's a great investment up front, and and especially like from our perspective, we interact with departments on campus like an agency where they are our clients, and we have to kind of convince them, like we can't just take over their site and give them a shiny product at the end of it. We really have to pull them through the process along the way, and what we found is involving them in that process, starting literally at a whiteboard with a couple of people from whatever that web team is, whether it's centralized, not centralized, or if people even report to each other, and then who kind of owns the site, who has ultimate sign-off, and the person who's more that day-to-day technical, like one who understands it, that has that savvy, and just mapping it out high level and then going deeper and deeper in and involving them in that process, that department of the process. It's a lot of time up front, but you'll find that the discussions get richer and richer and richer as time goes on, because they start to understand that this is a serious, a lot of these decisions are very serious. It's not just, oh, here's a new program outline, here you go, IT person, that this is maybe 10% of your job or 15% of your job, put this online. Like, that isn't doing your user any justice. And so the other thing that I wanted to mention was that I know that I hate reports personally, but I think that sometimes having somebody responsible for just putting together these KPIs and some high level analytics, not raw, maybe even not raw numbers, right, on a weekly or biweekly or monthly basis, to just put together whether they get all the way up to upper administration or not, gets those types of pages which might have been left behind or aren't being looked at because they're not screaming at somebody's faces, into at least somebody's mind throughout the year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have to agree. So, Nick, I want you to dive just a little bit deeper into how we maintain all of this information and maintenance on the web kind of in general, but as it relates to information architecture and keeping our user in mind. You started to talk about evolution, and I know you've written a few pieces about this idea, so could you summarize a little bit, and then maybe I can send out some tweets with the links to some of your writing?
Yeah, so I don't, unfortunately, I think that I haven't written recently on the topic, but it's something that I'm always working on in some sense or another, and I feel like everyone that it is in a web role at an institution should be working on, is evolving the navigation, the content, and the visual design of a site. And I try to approach it as, if you were to change one thing a month, on your site, what would it be? And you only got to choose one thing, and that's, even if you got it done in the first day, that's it. Let's change it, and then let's wait. And I try to use that approach for making changes over time. But taking one step back as far as the actual day-to-day maintenance of that, one of the things that we do that we found has been very helpful is that we allow the content owners to actually change, add and remove pages and things like that within their site, but the actual navigation is a construct that that the web team essentially and where I sit, central marketing kind of owns, right? So if you want to add an item to your navigation, we have no problem doing it, and we turn it around really quickly. But that allows us to be able to be kept in the loop about what are changes that are happening right now, what potential things are coming down the road, and how can we get in front of things that before you know it, 3 or 4 months down the road, a dean or director or somebody is like, oh, we need this on the site and this one thing on the site, and before you know it, that content person just does it because that's not their real job, right? And they just want to get on with their day. They add it to the main nav, they add it to this thing, and it gets unwieldy after a while. And that architecture, although you might have set it up in this pristine way, can easily be eroded without somebody, at least somebody watching as things evolve. And so for us, that has been a huge help to see, oh, well, you're adding this here, and you have another page that kind of talks about that same thing. Can we combine them, or do we pull these items up to a little bit higher level now that it's this time of year? And so it starts that discussion about the evolution of the architecture. So that way it isn't a one person's job. It is we're kind of helping being stewards on how they evolve their sites, even though they're the content experts, and at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to produce it. And so from our standpoint, that day-to-day, at least getting a handle on some piece of it, not at all. I'm not at all advocating, and I actually disadvocate for having some sort of workflow approval queue for like every single content update, because that only slows down the progress on the site. It yields to less people wanting to update their own websites because they know there's this process involved, and it also kind of breaks down this level of trust. And then, you know, if something's out there and doesn't look all that great for a few hours or a couple of days, and then you see it, and then you reach out to them and say, hey, can we help you fix this? Like, it's not going to be the end of the world, and it's going to bring a better relationship between you as the, you know, the more technical owner of that website and the actual content owner of that site.
I've got one thought just to piggyback on that, and it's just a direct quote from the Morville and Rosenfeld IA book, and it's basically that content management and information architecture are really two sides of the same coin, and that if you think of information architecture as portraying a snapshot of the information system as it is right this second, but content management as over time how that changes, you know, essentially showing how information flows into, around, and out of that information system over the course of time. That might help a little bit, because it's like any given IA document is only going to show you what it looks like now, and if you're doing it right, it's always going to change, right? So it's really a combination of information architecture and content management and maintenance of the information architecture, as Nick mentioned, is over time. And I really like the idea, Nick, that you of like doing timely stuff like seasonal information architecture. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Like if certain things are going to be more of a priority to people at different times in the cycle and different times of the year, and so prioritization and sequence is a huge piece of how we structure information. And if we're doing it contextually, according to, you know, what we know people are most interested in in general, yes, but also specifically at this moment in time, I think it's ultimately going to make it a more usable experience. So anyway, I think that's a really good point, Nick.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention the Higher Ed Live account posted 2 articles that actually are by Ron Bronson that talks about the death to the CMS, and you know, this notion of what the CMS used to be and how content is managed now is like, you know, when you really look back on like a logistics perspective, they're worlds apart, right? Like, what is content and what is the assets that are going out on the web, and how are they managed? And so, you know, traditionally content management systems literally were, here's a navigation, here's some files, and here's a page, and let's mash them up together, right? But they were like literally big blocks. Whereas now, you know, you can think of content management more from like a library standpoint, right? Where you have all of these books and there's all this metadata, this rich metadata about those books that you might not actually see on the front end. Well, you might be when you get to an actual like book, but like all of that metadata actually goes into how those books are found and how those books are categorized and things like that. That CMSs, I feel, you know, the CMSs that most institutions are using at this point are not yet to that level to take advantage of the content that's being put in them. They're literally just a way to publish a Word document in a different format. It's, you know, a single document in a single place with some, you know, some level of meta information on it, but not really understanding what that content is and how it fits into the bigger picture. And it might just, this, you know, I guess my experience is really tied towards higher education. So this might literally be a only higher education problem, and it might not be that other, you know, companies and things outside of higher ed have the same level of content problems that we do in higher ed. But I feel like, from my standpoint, I've not found a CMS that I've really felt has utilized the content that we have inside our higher ed to its fullest advantage on, you know, on the web.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another level that most of us aren't able to tap into that has to do with metadata and tagging, and, you know, the really imagine getting the types of results you get when you go to Amazon, although I hate to use that analogy because it's so different than higher ed, but like, how is Amazon figuring out what you are most interested in? Well, it's doing a whole lot of crunching, but really it's looking at, a whole bunch of tagging, like what have you searched for? What is that related to? Like what type, and there's like this whole information, this whole hidden metadata ecosystem that's running the back end of a lot of these e-commerce sites that are getting you really targeted information, and there's no reason to think that we couldn't do that with higher education, but it would require that upfront investment in time and resources and energy. I mean, WordPress has a really robust tagging system, and you can pull, think of how Pinterest pulls stuff in a sequence of different related items according to different tags. I mean, that's its main bread and butter way of doing things. And so, content tagging is a whole other ballgame that we could get into. But I think it's important for people to at least be aware that dynamically generated information systems are equally as important, if not more important, than the static. And by static, I mean the top-down information architecture that sits on your website and doesn't change. It's we're getting more and more used to and more comfortable with sites that literally just apply filters in real time, and we click on a tag and we get a different set of results, and we click on another tag and we get a subset of that result, and so on and so forth. And that's the type of thing that would be really exciting to see more of in higher ed. But it requires a really big investment in data collection and analysis and labeling and all kinds of other stuff too. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the frontier.
Yeah, and so that brings up a good point about like who then ultimately is in control of all of that. Is it, from an academic perspective, is it the provost that kind of, like, from the provost office, they're the ones who kind of know and are responsible for acquiring and placing that metadata on, say, academic pages and things like that, like, and then potentially, like, within a unit, there's career services area which has like internships and all of this other stuff that could really work both for current students and it could also work for prospective students to sell them on how many rich opportunities there is to for them and stuff like that. And so, like, where do you see, Fran, this kind of sitting from a responsibilities perspective? Like, is this an existing position that, like, or areas on campus, or is this something that has yet to be really determined or invented yet?
There's examples, but they're few and far between of people who have their title as user experience designer, information architect, and they're on campus teams, but they're the exception. Yeah. And so I think it falls on everybody. Again, it's like another hat that people need to wear and another skill set that people need to have who are already, doing all this work. I mean, justifying an information architecture position full time, I'm totally behind that. I think it's a necessity. I think people need to have that, or your UX specialist. But making that argument is really, really tough. So, like, the interim middle ground is to say you need to formally write these responsibilities into one or more people's positions so that they can be evaluated on it and they can get professional development on it, and they, so that's probably the first step, is to just having senior leadership acknowledge that it is a real thing that people really need to think about and do, and and it's going to be something that they're going to be evaluated on in their job description, and then maybe later on we'll get somebody who can who's doing it full time, and then using good examples from higher ed where there are people who have full-fledged teams, and outside of higher ed too. So every time one of the leadership says, I really like what Amazon's doing, you can be like, yeah, well, they have 450 people in their UX department, and so I'm making that number up, but like that's the answer to that. It's like, right, that's great, isn't it? Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with billions of dollars and hundreds of staff. So,
well, guys, I want to thank you for taking this conversation really deep. Actually, today I think there's a lot of great information and guidance for folks who are boots on the ground, working with user experience and information architecture. And Nick, I think you're hitting the nail on the head when you asked about roles and responsibilities around this content, because you know, even if you did have someone in a role at your university charged with that, there's still going to be that level of oversight coming from senior leadership. So when you say the provost, you know, I giggle that the provost would be in charge of that, but in reality, if you had an information architecture position on campus and it came to academic programming and how that fits in, that provost is going to want to have something to say about it. And what I'd like to leave our audience with as we wrap up today is the thing that I think we get stuck on when we have these discussions with senior leadership, and it's not all of the fun and exciting stuff that we got to talk about today, it almost always comes down to nomenclature. When it gets to the highest level, the only thing that I think we really get stuck on, and that is what senior leadership really cares about, is what the hell we name it. And that is, you know, I think it's a really tough battle for those who have been working on these projects and really understand the depth and the understanding that they had to kind of follow along in the whole project. And build things around, and then when it comes to that final sign-off, we get hung up on the names and naming things. So I want to just ask for some closing words and how maybe a little pep talk for our friends that are working with those decision makers. How do we make decisions around words, and how do we tame these ongoing battles that seem to happen on web teams and when they're in front of those senior leadership?
Yeah, I mean, so data is always nice to have in your back pocket when you enter these conversations. And fortunately, there's a suite of tools called Optimal Workshop. You can go to optimalworkshop.com. One of them is a digital card sorting tool. One of them is a digital information architecture tree testing tool. And, you know, it's crazy, but, like, you know, if you ask the people who are going to use your site, students, to categorize things and label things and tell you whether or not this makes sense, they'll do it, usually for a nominal fee or free food or something like that. And then you'll have actual data of the students telling you what you should call this, as opposed to administrators arguing with staff over what we should call something on a site that neither of us actually uses. So, you know,
nice if we listen to our students.
Yeah.
That's a really nice thought. That's a nice thought. Nick, do you have other nice thoughts for us?
The power of students is amazing. I will tell you that. And so if you bring enough a handful of them in a room with one of those administrators, you quickly find that if they'll hear these students, but then if they know that you're involving students in at least a level-headed discussion, you know, I've found that also brings some trust from those administrators down to that you're doing the right thing, and you're going to help make the right decisions, not just some arbitrary decisions that, you know, it's you know, my way of putting my name on the site. You know what I mean? Because I, you know, architected this navigation or this area or whatever, that you really kind of take it out of your own personality and out of your own hands and really put that ownership back on, we're doing this for the students, and this is what we've done to kind of get into their mind, including, you know, giving them pizza and letting them, you know, tell us how we should do it, and taking from that what we're actually going to do. So beyond that, I think that also you can't win every battle. So you can also, if you're not happy with, you know, one of these decisions, put it out there, put a test on it, whether that be an A/B test, whether it be like a click tracking test, whatever, and put an amount of time on it, and over time, you know, the right things are just going to work their way out through data.
Great points. Listen to your students and use them wisely. Set up A/B tests and fight the good fight. I want to thank Fran and Nick again for joining me today. It was a great conversation. Thanks always to our program sponsors, mStoner and Omni Update. We'll be back next week with shows from Admissions, Student Affairs, and Marketing Live. Do you need a reminder about our shows? You can receive a weekly nudge by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. If you want more professional development right now, go ahead and browse our archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. I'm Ashley Budd, and I will be back with you next month on Higher Ed Live. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley.